Have you ever thought about what it means to carry a man's name for 50 years when that name belongs to no grave, no monument, no confirmed date of death, just a coordinate in a jungle that officially never happened, and a silence the United States government has never fully broken? There are men alive today, old men now, former Special Forces operators, former Montagnard fighters who outlasted the war, who keep a photograph, not framed, folded, wallet-worn, carried through decades of ordinary life the way you carry something that refuses to lose its weight. A face they last saw in April of 1969 at a forward operating base in Southeast Asia that does not appear on any publicly available map from that era. The man in the photograph had long hair for a soldier. He kept a dog at the base. He had been operating in denied territory, Laos, Cambodia, the narrow spaces between official wars, for so long that the jungle had stopped feeling like hostile terrain. It had become something else entirely, something closer to home than anything waiting for him back in the United States. His name was Master Sergeant Jerry Shriver. His teammates called him Mad Dog. The North Vietnamese Army had their own name for him, something that translated roughly as the American who does not leave. He was in his mid-20s the first time he crossed into Laos on a mission that carried no official acknowledgement and offered no official protection. He kept crossing. And the men who went in alongside him, teams of 6, 8, 10 at most, dropped into denied territory against divisions they were never supposed to find, learned something that no training had prepared them for, that some men are built entirely for the space between wars, and that the space between wars has a way of keeping what it takes. Subscribe to this channel and hit the bell, because what was waiting for those teams inside that jungle had no name in any American manual, and the man who kept going back had already made a decision, somewhere quiet and unrecorded, that does not appear in any after-action report. The story of how that decision was made and what it cost everyone who followed him into the trees begins now. On the morning of April 24, 1969, before the helicopters lifted, Shriver checked his weapon, slow, methodical, one hand on the receiver, thumb across the bolt. The same check he had performed before every mission for 3 years. The men watching him from across the operations hut did not look at each other. They had seen it 100 times. He did not know it was the last time. They did. That weapon check, slow, methodical, thumb across the bolt, was the same motion they had watched him perform before every insertion for 3 years. They knew it was the last time because they had watched him change across those 3 years into something the jungle had shaped before any bullet did. Jerry Shriver had arrived in Vietnam in 1965 as a young Special Forces sergeant with a Green Beret qualification and a facility for languages that his commanders noted early. He was from Jacksonville, Florida. His father had served. He was not the kind of soldier who needed the war explained to him. He understood what he was there to do before he fully understood why it needed doing. What his commanders did not write down in those early evaluations was the other thing: that Shriver was one of those rare men in whom danger produces not fear, but clarity. The louder a situation became, the quieter he got. He had been assigned to MACV-SOG sometime in 1966. The Studies and Observations Group, named to communicate nothing to anyone without clearance, ran reconnaissance teams into Laos and Cambodia under classification so complete that American personnel captured or killed in those countries were, officially, not there. Families received letters that referenced Southeast Asia. The coordinates of deaths did not appear in any document a congressman could request. The missions did not exist in any public record. The men who ran them understood the arrangement before they signed on. Shriver's team was designated RT Python. He was the 1-0, the team leader, whose judgment was the last word on everything from the moment the helicopter lifted to the moment extraction arrived. His Montagnard fighters, Brue tribesmen for most of his missions, men whose families lived in the border country the war was being fought over, were among the finest light infantry in the theater. Shriver treated them with a respect that was, in the American military of that era, noteworthy. He learned fragments of their language. He shared their food. He slept where they slept. He did not treat them as assets. He treated them as the men they were. What he carried between missions, beyond his weapons, beyond the specialized equipment that SOG teams packed for denied area work, was a photograph of Klaus, a German Shepherd mix that had attached itself to him at Forward Operating Base 1 in Pubai, and that he had kept through a combination of charm and studied indifference to regulations. Klaus was the civilian detail, the proof that somewhere between insertions there was still a version of Jerry Shriver who needed something ordinary, something warm and uncomplicated. The photograph went into every mission folded in a cargo pocket. It had come back from every mission until April of 1969. 3 years of Prairie fire operations had made Shriver into something the Army's evaluation system had no category for. He was not reckless. Reckless men died in Laos quickly and in pieces. He was precise. Every movement in denied territory was deliberate. Every rest halt was chosen for defensibility before it was chosen for comfort. Every emergency extraction point was memorized before the team stepped off the helicopter, because in Laos, there was no calling for help and waiting. There was calling for help and surviving long enough for that help to reach you. And those were two entirely different problems that had to be solved simultaneously. What his teammates remembered most was the silence. Not the silence of a man with nothing to say. At the forward operating base, he could hold a conversation and hold a beer with equal ease. The silence of the field. In the jungle, he became something that moved without sound in terrain that made sound unavoidable. He had been hunted enough times and had hunted back enough times that the distinction between predator and prey had ceased to have much practical meaning for him. By 1968, the Prairie Fire Area of Operations, the corridor of southeastern Laos, through which the Ho Chi Minh Trail ran its most critical arteries, had become something that intelligence briefers struggled to convey accurately to commanders who had never seen it. It was not a trail. It was a nation buried in the jungle. Paved roads, underground fuel pipelines running hundreds of kilometers south, hospitals carved into limestone ridgelines, truck parks concealed under triple canopy cover large enough to hide convoys from aerial observation. Protecting all of it, the Doan 559, the 559th Transportation Group, grown from a few thousand engineers in 1959 to an estimated 80,000 military personnel by the late 1960s, including dedicated anti-infiltration units whose specific mission was to find and eliminate teams like Shriver's. What those teams brought out of the jungle, when they made it back, was intelligence that contradicted repeatedly what was being reported publicly about the air campaign against the trail. The road crews were repairing damage faster than aircraft could inflict it. The pipelines were underground and invisible. The supply system was not being degraded. The teams knew this because they had walked through the repair crews at night and counted the trucks. Stories like Jerry Shriver's don't survive in official records. They survive because the men who served alongside him chose to keep carrying the memory when the government chose to file the paperwork. If you carried something across a deployment, a photograph, a name you couldn't say out loud when you came home, a face that still finds you in the early hours of the morning, the comment section below is where that memory belongs. Add yours. Dong Nguyen had commanded the Dong 559 since 1967, and by the spring of 1969 he understood the problem of the American reconnaissance teams with a clarity that came from watching them operate across 2 full operational cycles. He was not a logistics commander in the conventional sense. The 559th Transportation Group, which he oversaw, was responsible not merely for moving supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but for sustaining the entire northern war effort south of the demilitarized zone. Without the trail, without the continuous flow of ammunition, weapons, replacement troops, and fuel that the 559th pushed southward through Laos, every North Vietnamese division operating in South Vietnam faced attrition without resupply. The trail was not one of the war's factors. It was the war's spine. And small teams of Americans were walking through it, not in the hundreds, not with the firepower that would require a conventional tactical response. 6 men, sometimes 8, dropped from helicopters before dawn, moving on foot through mountain jungle for days, recording coordinates and documenting infrastructure that the American air campaign was supposed to be destroying. Dong Nguyen had access to the analysis when those teams were found and their materials recovered. What they had documented before being compromised, road grades, fuel depot positions, truck park capacities, was detailed enough that he understood the intelligence value his enemy was extracting. A 6-man team with accurate coordinates was, in terms of operational damage potential, more dangerous than a battalion. The institutional response was deliberate. Within the 559th's security structure, anti-infiltration companies were given specific tasking. Not to monitor the border for crossings and report, but to hunt. To identify patterns, insertion zone signatures, vegetation disturbance, the brief radio transmissions American teams sent after making initial contact, and then close the distance before extraction could reach them. The men assigned to this work were not garrison troops. They were trackers, selected for patience and physical endurance, trained in the same denied area movement that the Americans were using against them. They understood the terrain because they lived in it. They understood the teams because they had studied what was left behind when an operation failed. Their primary technique, refined across multiple operational cycles, was positioning not where a team was first detected, but where the team would move when it knew it had been detected. The logic was elegant and lethal. A compromised SOG team had limited options: move toward an extraction zone, call for helicopter support, hold a perimeter long enough to be pulled out. The anti-infiltration companies of the 559th did not chase teams toward extraction. They were already at extraction. The terrain between first contact and the helicopter skid was where the real killing happened. The tracking team sergeant, who would eventually follow Shriver's trace to the final insertion zone, had spent 3 years refining that technique against multiple SOG teams. He had a working knowledge of the corridor's extraction zones, every clearing large enough for a helicopter, every ridge that offered approach geometry for door gunners, every valley that funneled evading men toward the same 3 or 4 defensible high points. He did not need to know which team was coming. He needed to know the terrain. And the terrain did not change. They were not wrong to believe they were winning that particular fight. Of the SOG teams that operated in Prairie fire across those years, casualty rates were severe by any conventional standard. Teams compromised, teams extracted under fire, teams that called for emergency extraction and did not survive long enough to reach the pickup zone. The men who ran the anti-infiltration operations were professionals who understood what they were doing and why it mattered. They understood that the Americans they were hunting were also professionals. That recognition was not sentiment, it was tactical respect, the kind that exists between men who understand each other's work from the inside. What neither side could fully account for was the compound effect of accumulated experience in both directions. The anti-infiltration companies were getting better at finding the teams. The teams were getting better at surviving being found. Each cycle produced survivors who returned more capable than they had gone in, until the border corridor of southeastern Laos had become a laboratory for a kind of human specialization that existed nowhere else in the war. Both sides had men who had been there long enough that the jungle had become the primary fact of their existence. Both sides had men who sent letters home to families who did not know where they were. Both sides had men who understood, by 1969, that the fight they were in had taken on a geometry that had little to do with the political questions that had started it. What it had become was a test of something more specific: how long a man could operate at the absolute edge of what human beings can endure, and what remained of him on the other side. If you're watching this, you already belong to a smaller group than you think. People who understand that military history isn't about tactics and hardware. It's about human beings making impossible decisions under impossible conditions. Subscribe and join the ones who refuse to forget. The helicopter set them down in the dark. Not darkness as soldiers experienced it at established bases, the managed darkness of perimeter lights and generator hum. This was the darkness of a jungle that had been growing for centuries without interruption, pressing in from every side with a weight that new team members never quite anticipated until they were standing in it. The triple canopy forest above the insertion zone had already swallowed the sound of the departing aircraft before the last man was off the skid. Shriver held the team still for 3 minutes. Standard protocol after insertion. Absolute stillness. Every man listening for any deviation from the ambient sound of the jungle around them. The insects had gone quiet when the helicopter arrived and were slowly returning. First the high register, then the lower frequencies, then the full layered texture of a living forest at rest. He was listening for the gaps. A tracking unit moving toward the insertion point would suppress the insects in its path the same way the aircraft had. The gaps told you where the problem was before the problem arrived. Nothing. The team moved. The jungle in the Prairie fire corridor in the summer months had a specific quality to it that no amount of prior training had prepared any American soldier to carry hour after hour. Not heat. The canopy filtered direct sun well enough that the temperature under the trees was manageable. The weight was moisture. The air had a density that, after the first hour of movement, felt less like breathing than like working against a medium that resisted being moved through. Every item of gear, radio, water, ammunition, absorbed that moisture and became heavier across the hours. Soldiers who had operated in other environments and then came to the trail corridor reported being surprised, even on their third and fourth mission, by how completely the environment consumed attention. The jungle demanded constant processing. Every sound, every shift in the insect register, every shadow that resolved differently on a second look required an immediate threat assessment that, compounded across a 12-hour movement, produced a kind of exhaustion that sleep did not cure. By the summer of 1968, Shriver had run enough missions in this corridor to have developed what his teammates described as terrain memory. an ability to correlate map contour lines to physical features in near darkness that looked, from outside, like instinct. He moved the team northeast along a ridgeline, putting elevation between themselves and the valley floor, where he knew from previous missions that the 559th's truck convoys ran through the night on roads that American aerial photography had cataloged but could never fully count. They found the first road on the second day, not a trail. A graded surface, laterite gravel compacted to hold truck weight through the wet season, wide enough for vehicles to pass in both directions. Fresh tire marks in the shoulder, heavy vehicles, dual rear axle, the ruts left by loaded military trucks rather than light transports. The team documented the width, the drainage construction, the evidence of recent maintenance work. Shriver ran a compass bearing to correlate the road orientation with the known trail network, estimated the gradient, sketched the approximate coordinates in the log, and moved the team back into the tree line before allowing himself a full breath. He didn't know it yet, but 3 hours behind them, a tracking unit of the 559th Security Battalion had found the insertion zone. The grass in the clearing had been bent, not by wind, by the weight and direction of men moving northeast from a center point. The tracking unit sergeant identified the sign within minutes of entering the zone. He noted the time, transmitted a contact report on his unit frequency, and began following the trail north. He was not in a hurry. Hurried pursuit made noise. He was patient, and patience in this terrain was its own form of violence. The problem with the road, with how clear the intelligence was, with how precisely it documented what the air campaign was failing to achieve, was that it required time. Shriver kept the team at the second road junction for 90 minutes, long enough to count the passing traffic during a single observation window. 14 trucks, loaded, southbound, running blacked out except for faint cat-eye reflectors on the vehicles ahead. His 1-1 recorded the count, the vehicle spacing, the estimated cargo load based on suspension compression visible through the vegetation in the moonlight. This was the kind of data that would, in an American headquarters 3 days later, cause a general to stare at a map and revise an estimate that had been wrong for months. It was also the kind of data that required standing still. What Shriver couldn't see from his position was the tracking team working up the eastern slope of the ridge. They had adjusted their bearing twice, correcting for the team's movement, and were now less than 200 meters behind and slightly uphill, a position that gave them elevation and a clear line of observation into the area below, where the SOG team's silhouettes were visible against the faint reflected light of the road. The sound was wrong. Not the truck engines. Those were consistent, expected. Something underneath the mechanical register, something organic and close, displaced in the vegetation to the east, 40 meters at most. Shriver heard it before he processed it. His hand was already moving when his mind formed the word. The team broke into the contact drill before he gave a signal. They had practiced the pattern until it ran below conscious decision. His 1-1 taking the western movement with 2 Brew fighters. Shriver covering the eastern approach with the remaining men, the emergency extraction frequency already dialed. The radio call went out in the code sequence that meant contact imminent, send now, and the response from the aerial relay aircraft came back within seconds. 30 minutes to extraction, possibly less. 30 minutes was a long time. The first burst of fire came from above and to the right, a probing volley designed not to kill immediately, but to force movement, to push the team toward the western slope where a second element would be waiting. Shriver recognized the tactic. He had seen it work on other teams. He did not move west. He moved east, into the tracking unit, into the fire. When you walk toward the people shooting at you, you remove the geometry of their plan. The distance collapses. The supporting element to the west becomes irrelevant. The fight becomes close and decided by whoever can operate in that proximity without hesitation. Shriver had been in that proximity before. The tracking unit sergeant understood, in the next 90 seconds of contact at ranges under 20 meters, that the man he had been following moved the way men moved when they were entirely at home. The extraction came over the ridgeline 22 minutes after the radio call. 3 men wounded, none dead. Shriver was the last one on the skid. The Klaus photograph was still in his pocket. He was back in Laos 11 days later. The tracking unit sergeant made his report, noted the direction of extraction, and returned to his unit's operational routine. He was already studying the map for the next likely insertion zone. There were patterns in how that team operated. There were always patterns. In the spring of 1969, the Anti-Infiltration Command of the Dome 559 believed they had identified one that belonged specifically to the team that kept coming back. By the early spring of 1969, Shriver had been assigned to a Hatchet Force platoon, a larger element than the small reconnaissance teams he had led through Prairie fire, designed for direct action against specific targets rather than silent observation. It was an acknowledgement of what he had become, a man whose operational instincts were too valuable to deploy on collection alone. The Hatchet Force was heavier, louder, more prepared to make contact and absorb it. It was, in a sense, the logical evolution of everything he had spent 3 years building. There was a dark irony in it that he understood without needing to say it out loud. He had walked through the trail for 3 years to find what was there. Now he was going back to hit what he had found. The night before the mission, he sat outside the operations hut with his 1-1 for an hour. They did not talk about the objective. They talked about food, specifically the kind that did not exist within several hundred kilometers of their current position. His 1-1 was from Louisiana. The conversation turned absurd within 10 minutes and stayed there. 2 men who knew what the morning held, choosing to spend an hour somewhere else entirely. Shriver laughed at something. The exact thing is not recorded. The men nearby who heard it noted it later. Not because laughter was unusual, because of how ordinary it sounded. Like a man with no particular reason to be anywhere other than right there. The target was a suspected base area near the Cambodia border, a complex that aerial reconnaissance and signals intelligence had identified as a significant logistics node, possibly connected to the command structure coordinating North Vietnamese Army operations across the border into South Vietnam. The intelligence was 3 weeks old. Shriver knew this. He knew what 3 weeks meant in a sector where the 559th's security posture adapted continuously to the patterns of the teams running against it. He did not raise the question formally. It had already been considered at a level above his clearance, and the answer had been the go. On the evening of April 23rd, he spread his map on a table and walked his element leaders through the plan for the 4th time. The objective was straightforward in the way that assault plans are straightforward on paper. Insert, move to target, assault, extract. The complications lived in the terrain between the insertion zone and the target, in the response time of whatever security force the 559th had positioned in that sector, and in the extraction corridor, a valley that his experience told him was probably watched. What would you do? Not as a planner working from a briefed room with the luxury of revision time. As the man who knew that corridor better than any other American alive, who had read the patterns of the anti-infiltration units hunting him for years, who understood that the intelligence supporting this mission was 3 weeks stale. What would you do with that knowledge, at that table, with the go already given and 30 men waiting on your assessment? That question does not have a clean answer in any memoir or debrief or official history of the program. What it has is what the men who knew him provide when asked directly, that he had been running this same calculus since the first mission, and the answer had always come out the same way. You go. You go because the men depending on you go. You go because the alternative, declining on the basis of a risk assessment that every mission carried, was not a version of himself he had ever built in. The 3 weeks of stale intelligence was a concern. It was not a reason to stop. Shriver put the map away and went to check on the dog. On the other side of that border, the tracking unit that had been repositioned into the sector 3 weeks prior had done exactly what its operational orders required. The analysis of SOG insertion patterns in the corridor and the specific behavioral signature of the team that kept returning had been compiled at the anti-infiltration headquarters across multiple operational cycles. The positioning was not improvised. It was the result of patient analysis by men who had been doing this long enough to understand that their most effective tool was not superior firepower, but superior patience. They were in the right place. They had been there long enough that waiting had become indistinguishable from readiness. The tracking unit sergeant who had read Shriver's pattern from 3 directions over 18 months understood on the morning of April 24th that this insertion felt different. The hatchet force size was visible in the noise footprint even before the helicopters touched down. This was not a small recon team. It was something prepared to take contact and push through it. He adjusted his unit's position accordingly, pulling the perimeter closer to the landing zone, sacrificing reaction distance for density. If the Americans were coming in prepared to fight, the fight needed to happen before they could establish momentum. On the morning of April 24th, after the weapon check, the helicopters flew northwest. The first contact came within an hour of insertion, not the gradual detection and pursuit that characterized most compromised recon operations, immediate, heavy fire from positions that suggested the landing zone approach had been identified before the insertion began. The hatchet force returned fire, fell back to a secondary position, and Shriver began working the radio for extraction while managing the perimeter. The enemy force was larger than the intelligence had suggested, significantly larger. The decision, when it came, was not deliberated. He ordered his indigenous fighters to move toward the extraction zone. He told his radio operator to keep transmitting. He moved toward the contact. The last transmission reached the relay aircraft clearly. His voice, calm in the way it was always calm under fire, the volume dropping rather than rising, the words precise and operational. He was managing the covering action. The platoon was moving. He had a position. The extraction helicopters reached the zone 11 minutes later. The platoon came out. The American was not with them. The relay aircraft held the frequency for 6 hours. No further transmissions were received. And somewhere in the jungle below, a war that officially did not exist was still being fought by a man who had long since stopped asking whether the ground was worth the cost. The helicopters that had extracted the Hatchet Force platoon returned to Forward Operating Base 1 before noon on April 24th. The debriefs began within the hour. The bright light call went out before the debriefs were finished. A bright light team, the SOG designation for operations going back in after Americans who had not come out, was being assembled before the sun moved. Bright light was among the most dangerous work in the SOG portfolio. It went into areas where the enemy already knew Americans had been operating, often into ongoing contact, with the specific task of finding a man who might be wounded, might be captured, might have evaded, and be waiting at an emergency rendezvous. The men who volunteered understood the mathematics. They went anyway. The first insertion on April 25th found nothing. The contact area had been swept. The 559th's security units were still in position. The bright light team made contact within minutes of reaching the objective area and was extracted under fire. A second attempt produced the same result. Heavy resistance, no trace, forced extraction. The team leader on the first bright light insertion was a sergeant who had served alongside Shriver on a Prairie fire operation the previous year. He had volunteered within minutes of the call going out. When his team was pulled out from the 25th, he requested to go back the following morning. He went. The result was the same. He requested a third insertion. His commander approved it. The third attempt reached a position 600 meters from the last known coordinate before contact made further movement impossible. He was extracted. He would spend the next 30 years attempting to obtain declassified documents related to the search. He never stopped looking. He wasn't there, or he was there and could not be reached. The distinction, the one that has never been resolved, is what has made Jerry Shriver's case one that veteran communities and the families of the missing have returned to for 5 decades. Not because his case was unique in the record of men lost in denied territory, because of what it represents. A man who had survived everything the trail had thrown at him for 3 years, whose disappearance carries the particular weight of the unfinished sentence. While the bright light operations continued and then stopped, something else happened that the official record does not capture, but that his teammates have described consistently. The teams kept going in. Other teams, other 1-0s, the same Prairie fire corridor, the same protocols, the same emergency extraction frequencies that Shriver had used. They went in the week after he disappeared, and the week after that, through the remainder of the operational season. None of them described it as tribute. They described it as the work, the same thing Shriver had understood and that they had understood from watching him, that the alternative to continuing was leaving the ground to the 559th completely. What none of them knew, what would not become clear until the intelligence picture was fully assembled in the months that followed, was that the missions immediately after Shriver's disappearance produced some of the most significant trail documentation of the entire Prairie fire program. As if the sector, having finally kept what it had been trying to keep for 3 years, had opened itself slightly to the men who came after him. What those continued insertions produced, cumulatively, across the remainder of 1969, was the completion of the intelligence picture that Prairie fire had been building since '66. The trail documentation became comprehensive enough that American targeting doctrine shifted. Specific resupply corridors were identified, targeted, and disrupted. The 559th adapted, as it always did. But adaptation cost time, and time in a logistics system operating at the edge of its capacity was not an abstraction. It was ammunition that arrived 2 weeks late. It was replacement troops who reached their units in condition for static defense rather than offensive operations. None of that was visible in any single report, all of it compounded. On the other side of the contact, the tracking unit sergeant understood, in the hours after April 24th, that his unit had done everything correctly. His men had been in the right place. The American had not been extracted. By the only operational metric that mattered in his world, the mission had succeeded. What he could not account for, what did not have a place in any after-action framework he had been given, was the 6 hours the relay aircraft spent holding the frequency after the platoon had been pulled out. The absence of a transmission that never came. He had been in this work long enough to understand what it meant when a man with that record went silent and did not come back. He understood it the way soldiers on both sides of any honest war come to understand the men they have been fighting, not as an abstraction, but as a fact, as something that had been present in the corridor so long that its absence changed the dimensions of the space. The Montagnard fighters who had served alongside Shriver across 3 years of Prairie fire understood this in terms that required no translation. They had a concept in their tradition, not precisely equivalent to any English word, for the kind of man who carries a territory inside him rather than passing through it, who belongs to a place in a way that the place itself recognizes. They had seen it in Shriver from the early missions. He had chosen to stay in every sense that mattered, from the first insertion to the last. That was not a tactical decision. It was something older. Dong Seung Nguyen, reading his own after-action reports across the late spring of '69, understood that the American who had not come back had been more dangerous than a battalion. Not because of what he could do in a contact at 20 meters, because of what he had been carrying out of the jungle for 3 years. The documentation was already in American hands. The trail was already mapped in operational detail that had not existed before the Prairie fire teams began walking through it. You could stop the man. You could not stop what the man had already done. It wasn't about firepower. It had never been about firepower. It was about 6 men walking into the space between official wars and refusing to come back without the truth of what was happening there. And the truth, once extracted from a jungle and written down, does not go back. Forward operating base. One was quiet for 3 days after the platoon came back. Not the quiet of an operation completed and filed. The administrative silence of a base returning to routine. The quiet of a space from which something had been removed that had been so consistently present that its absence changed the texture of the air. Shriver's bunk was made. His gear was stowed in the particular way he stowed it, not with military precision exactly, but with the organizational logic of a man who knew in complete darkness and complete urgency where every item was. Klaus was at the base, waiting with the patience that dogs apply to the incomprehensible facts of human absence, moving between the operations hut entrance and the landing pad when helicopters came in, returning each time to the same spot when they did not bring back the man he was waiting for. The base itself in those days had a specific quality to the light, not different in any way a photograph would capture. The same flat tropical overcast that characterized the region through most of the spring. But the men who were there have described it consistently across multiple independent accounts as heavier, as if the weight was in the atmosphere rather than only in the people who moved through it. The ground equipment hummed. The helicopters came and went on other missions. The meals were the meals they had always been. And Klaus kept returning to the landing pad. The men who had served with Shriver did not talk about it directly. The debriefs were clinical, operational details extracted by intelligence officers who needed the information and understood that the men providing it were operating at the limit of what they could professionally sustain. They answered the questions. They signed the forms. They returned to their bunks and lay in the dark. One of his Brew team members, a man who had walked alongside Shriver on 17 Prairie fire insertions, who had been in the same contacts and the same extraction zones for 3 consecutive years, sat outside the operations hut on the night of the 25th and said nothing for 4 hours. His interpreter explained later what he was doing, a ceremony of his own tradition, a period of silence for a man who had died in the jungle, to give the spirit time to leave the trees and find its way. The Americans nearby said nothing. Some of them sat with him, not because they understood the ceremony, because they understood the silence. The cost of the Prairie Fire program, accumulated across the years of Shriver's service alone, was not countable in any single report. American lives, indigenous lives, Brew and Nung fighters who went in on every team, who took casualties at rates that American record-keeping treated as a secondary category, who had families in the border country the war was consuming. The 559th's anti-infiltration units had their own losses. Men who had spent years tracking teams through terrain that killed as efficiently as any weapon, who had been in the same firefights from the other side of the muzzle. The tracking unit sergeant who had read Shriver's pattern across 18 months was killed 6 months after April 24th, in contact with another SOG team in an adjacent corridor. He had been competent at difficult work, and the work had eventually done what it always does to the men who perform it long enough. His name is not in any American record. He had a family. He had a commander who noted his loss in the 559th's operational log. Both sides had their ceremonies. Both sides had their silence. The Klaus photograph was not found in Shriver's gear. It had been in his pocket when the helicopters lifted on the morning of April 24th. It was not among the personal effects returned to the forward base. Whether it is in the jungle still, dissolved by decades of moisture and heat, or whether it is somewhere else entirely, no one can say with certainty. What it was is clear enough. The one civilian thing he had carried through 3 years of the most dangerous, sustained operations the war produced. The proof that somewhere between missions, a version of Jerry Shriver had needed something ordinary, something that did not require a threat assessment. It went into the field with him every time. It came back from every mission until it didn't. And in that small fact, a wallet photograph of a dog carried into a jungle that kept it is a weight that no after-action report has ever found a category for. The men who survived Shriver did not return to ordinary life in any clean sense. They returned to the world, where their families were, where their houses were, where the machinery of civilian existence continued in perfect indifference to what had happened in a jungle that most of the people around them could not locate on a map. The classification kept them from explaining it for years. When the classification came off, the words were still not quite adequate. The weight had been there too long to respond to paperwork. What they carried alone. Not the specific details, those came out in layers across the decades. The weight itself. The particular quality of having known a man so completely defined by a space that he had in some final accounting remained there, of having been the ones who came out when he did not. One of the team members, interviewed decades later, was asked whether he thought Shriver had known, going into the final mission, that it was different from the others. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He always knew. Every mission he always knew. That's what made him what he was. He knew and he went anyway. Every single time. And I still don't know if that's the bravest thing I've ever seen or the saddest thing I've ever seen." He did not resolve the question. Some questions aren't for resolving. Days turned to weeks. Weeks turned to years. And the weight never got lighter. Jerry Shriver was carried as missing in action from April 24, 1969. In 1978, his status was amended to killed in action, body not recovered, the designation for a man whose death is accepted as factual by the available evidence but whose physical remains have never been found. The designation carries no coordinate. It carries no confirmed account. It carries, in the bureaucratic language of a government form, the acknowledgement that a man was lost in a place that officially did not exist and cannot be fully accounted for in the manner the official record requires. He was 28 years old. The men who served alongside him did not stop looking when the official designation was made. Veterans of SOG operations filed Freedom of Information requests, traveled to Southeast Asia when diplomatic relations allowed, met informally with Vietnamese veterans, men who had been in the same general sector in the same general season, who might have seen something. Researchers working the MIA files found documents that had been reclassified, declassified, and partially released in versions that answered some questions and opened others. No remains have been recovered. No definitive account has emerged. What has emerged as the Prairie Fire files were partially declassified across the decades is a clearer picture of what the program accomplished and what it cost. The reconnaissance intelligence collected by SOG teams between 1966 and 1971 documented the trail in operational detail that had not previously existed in American strategic planning. The teams provided evidence, at consistent and severe cost, that the trail was not a vulnerability waiting to be closed by air power, but an adaptive logistics system capable of absorbing interdiction and reconstituting faster than it could be destroyed. What commanders and policymakers did with that evidence is a question that belongs to the historians and the families of every American who fought a war partly premised on assumptions those teams had already disproved on the ground. He knew, in the 3 years he spent walking through that evidence, that what was being asked of him and the men who went alongside him did not have a clean name in any doctrine he had ever read. He kept going back anyway, not because the strategy made sense to him, but because the men in the teams made sense to him. Because the Brew fighters and the 1-1s and the other 1-0s working adjacent sectors were the most honest thing he had encountered in the war. He understood, by some accounting that ran below the level of policy, that the honest thing was worth protecting. Whether the war that surrounded it deserved the men who fought it is a question that, in the years after Vietnam, the country has not fully answered to the satisfaction of the people who were actually there. That is not a political statement. It is what the men who came back have said in their own ways, across 50 years of interviews and memoirs and late-night conversations at reunions that became smaller every decade. They were not asking for agreement. They were asking for honesty. The men who survived the Prairie Fire program and returned to civilian life have by now mostly reached their 80s. Some have written memoirs. Some testified before committees. Some have been remarkably silent. What they share, regardless of how much they have said publicly, is the specific quality that comes from having done something that the rest of the world agreed, by official consensus, did not happen. The declassification did not erase that quality. It just made the original silence more visible in retrospect. There are men alive right now who keep a photograph, not of Shriver. That photograph went into the jungle with him. Of themselves, in a younger version, at a forward operating base in Southeast Asia on a morning before a mission. The photograph is wallet-worn. It has been with them a long time. They carry it the way you carry something that refuses to lose its weight. The way you carry a name that belongs to no grave. If you served or knew someone who served, their sacrifice was real. Their courage was real. Subscribe and join those who refuse to forget. Share this story if you believe these experiences matter. Honor the warriors. Question the wars.